Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is a history of Asia. Wow, what a topic! Let's first of all start with the boundaries of Asia. To the north, the Arctic Ocean, the frozen ocean, at the top of the world. To the east, the Pacific Ocean. To the south, the Indian Ocean, and closer to the shoreline, the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. And to the west, the Red Sea between Arabia and Africa, and then the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea. And then to the northwest, the Ural Mountains in Russia. Actually, Russia is west of the Urals is considered Europe. East is considered Asia. So Russia is European and Asian. And actually, at one time, Alaska was Russian. So one time, Russia was European, Asian, and American. Just imagine going all the way around the world. Okay, and some other landforms, geographical landforms, the Himalaya Mountains in northern India and Nepal, highest mountains in the world. Geologists believe, that India one time was a sort of a very large island, and it collided against the Asian mainland and pushed up the Himalaya Mountains, and apparently there's still pressure. So supposedly the Himalaya Mountains are continuing to grow in size, in height. Okay, and then you have the river. Some of the rivers, the famous the Ganges River in India, the holy river of Hindus. They believe they like to bathe in the Ganges. So they feel they're purified. In China, the Yangtze River and the Yellow River. And in Vietnam, the Mekong River, and the Yalu River between Korea and China. Okay, so that's some of our geography. Much of Central Asia into China and Russia is sort of a semi-desert, not very fertile. And of course, you have a big change in climates from the far north in Siberia, very, very cold, to the Southeast Asia, which is very warm and tropical. Now, if we go back, now the thing that's striking in Asian history, or about Asia, is two countries, India and China, both very large, and both have been around a long, long time. You can't say that about any other country in Asia. Their longevity is amazing. And, they more than 1,000 years ago, India and China were both wealthy, powerful countries. And then they went into severe decline 100 years ago. They were both very, very weak and poor. But both India and China have revived, and today they have grown dramatically in wealth and power in recent years. So they made a comeback, very inspiring, India and China. So those are the two most important countries in Asian history, in my opinion. And of the two, I think the greatest country in the world is India. We live, as human beings, we are material and spiritual. Both are important, but we very often we don't think of spirituality very much. We think of material wealth, but there is spiritual wealth as well. Spiritual wealth would be joy and peacefulness and kindness and so forth. And of course, spiritual poverty would be anger and selfishness and greed. And of course, these are important things in life. And India has been the great land of spirituality, developing union with God contact, and becoming joyful, happy, peaceful as a result. And if you go back 5,000 years, I think the most amazing person in history was Bhagavan Krishna, that I'm aware of, because he was a great saint and a king in India. Just imagine, incredible. And he was really probably the personification of the last high age. Of course, we've talked before, the last high age, maybe 13,000 years ago, the world was very advanced, and there were these two great civilizations, Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean and Lemuria in the Pacific, and both disappeared as the world went into decline. And after they disappeared, India became the center or the location for wisdom from the past high age. And of course, it became a very materially poor country. So India, a great land of spirituality, and these tremendous saints, Bhagavan Krishna, Lord Buddha, who came from India and who established Buddhism, of which most of Asia became Buddhist. For example, China, India, Japan, much of Southeast Asia became Buddhist. Lord Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, similar to Krishna from the standpoint that he was a king and who actually relinquished his throne to seek God contact. Tremendous human being who, these saints are forces, so tremendous forces for good in the world, helping human beings emerge from barbarism and become better people and a more peaceful, kindly world. And then the other saints, actually Akbar, who was a Muslim saint in India. And in modern times, Mahatma Gandhi, who was the political saint, who used spirituality, who injected spirituality in politics. Incredible. And this is something we really need today with all the political problems in the world, spirituality. So India, a land of tremendous spiritual wealth. And actually, it's associated, the small country, kind of forgotten today, Tibet, on the border of India, in China, since 1954, in part of China. Also a very spiritual country. So India's played a major role in history. Now, of course, China is tremendous power for a long, long time, very powerful country. They had the Great Wall of China that they built, still this amazing thing, the only man-made thing visible from outer space. And, of course, the various dynasties in China, the Ming dynasty, which is associated with vases, and the Qin, I think that's how China got its name, and the Tang and Manchu from Manchuria. Various families who ruled China. Early on they would do a good job as in terms of government. Then they would become lazy and corrupt, and then eventually there would be discontent and civil war, and a new family, a new dynasty would take over China. Okay, so China. Okay, now as we're moving forward, if we go into the 600s, of course, another major force in Asian history was the life and legacy of Muhammad, the great saint who founded Islam, which spread across North Africa, but which also spread into much of Asia, into Central Asia, into India, Islam, and into Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and into what became the Philippines. So Islam has been a very important part in Asian history, and actually even into China, northwestern China, which is Xinjiang, or Chinese Turkestan. And actually early on, Islam was an important force in Asian history, and you could say early on Arab Islam, because it started in Arabia. And then later, the center of power in the Muslim world shifted to Turkey. And then it was, you could say, Turkish Islam. And then Turkey actually had the Turkish presence in Asia is very important, because there's actually Turkmenistan, former part of the Soviet Union. And then actually, like we mentioned, northwestern China, Xinjiang, or Chinese they call it, Xinjiang, is Chinese Turkestan, or like a Turkish part of China, where they're Muslim, so forth. So the Muslim influence has been a very important part of Asian history. Now moving forward about 900 years ago, the Mongol Empire, came out of nowhere. The Mongols, just imagine, and they were horse people, warriors, tremendous, and they created an incredible empire, including China and Russia, and the largest land-based empire, all one big piece of land. Incredible. Genghis Khan, of course, the famous founder of that empire, and the Mongols were pretty hard on people. The stories that you hear about with the devastation that they would wreak in their conquest, where they kill a lot of people and enslave children, rape women, and so forth. In fact, they say that Genghis Khan is the something like 5 or 8% of Asians are descendants of Genghis Khan. So you can see his proclivity for male-female relations. Okay, so the thing about the Mongol Empire is, actually, I don't think the Russians have ever gotten over it, because they say the Russians, it was the Mongols, it was so devastating, the Mongol conquest and all the death and destruction, that the Russians, during the Soviet Union, when they seemed to be very passive, when the communist government did these horrendous things to the people there, and enslaved millions of people. And I've read historians believe that the Russians developed a sense of hopelessness or passivity, that they couldn't really, they had to maybe overly accepting. And of course, but the thing is about the Mongols, the Mongols were even threatened Europe, but were stopped by the Hungarians. So the Hungarians are very proud of that. But the thing about the Mongols is they created once the empire was established, there was security, and you could travel within the Mongol Empire, and of course the famous Italian, what's his name? Guy from Italy traveled all the way to China, back and forth. Marco Polo, right? Yeah, he traveled because of the security of the Mongol Empire, kind of like the Roman Empire. He was able to travel from Europe all the way to the east coast of China, and then come back. And I think he met Kublai Khan. And so, and he had these stories of the wealth of China. Now, over the centuries, there had been a robust trade between Europe and Asia. Of course, the Europeans didn't have as much to trade with, but especially we talked before about the silk and spices of Asia, which Europeans, like the silk as a clothing material and the spices to make food more enjoyable. And there's a long trade overland from across Central Asia. And some of these places are now really forgotten now, like Tashkent and Samarkand, these way stations on the Silk Route between Europe and Asia. But this really led to the interest of Europeans in trading with Asia by water. So now we're moving forward toward the more closer to the modern era, when the Europeans, the age of exploration for European countries. Now the Chinese actually earlier, probably in the 1400s, they could have, there's a book called 1421, When China Discovered America. Apparently there was a Chinese voyage to America, and the Chinese decided no, they weren't really that interested. They thought these other countries don't have anything that we want. So they didn't really pursue exploration, where the Europeans did, because they wanted to create empires, and they did establish empires. So in the modern world, you've had, the European conquest of the world, and India became British, and actually crown jewel in the British crown, and or the British Empire. And Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos became French colonies. Indonesia became Dutch from Holland, and the Philippines became Spanish. And Japan was never conquered. China wasn't exactly conquered, but spheres of influence were created in China. And one of the greatest crimes in history was perpetuated by the British. Yeah, I have a British background, and I have a high regard for Great Britain because they developed democracy and the rule of law and use of reason. But the very bad thing they did to make money, and because of greed, was they forced opium on the Chinese. Opium they grew in India so they created millions of drug addicts in China, and this was really the low point in Chinese history, you'd have to say. Millions of their people who were drug addicts. Very, very discouraging. And when the authorities protested to the British, this is in the 1800s, the British just started firing cannons to make the Chinese submit. And by this time, we're getting, see, the thing is, the Europeans had this aggressive attitude, and into the Industrial Revolution, they had, firepower because of superior military technology. The Chinese had to submit. It was very, very humiliating, embarrassing, and tragic. They couldn't stop drug trafficking in China. Horrific. And actually, during the same era, there were Christian missionaries in China, including some from this area in Ohio, Oberlin, Ohio, and the Boxer Rebellion, when Chinese were fed up with what foreigners were doing, and killed American missionaries in China. And there's a Boxer Rebellion memorial here in Oberlin, Ohio. It's pretty nice. It has these curving pillars to memorialize those missionaries who died in China. But in a way, you can understand the Chinese position, because they're pretty fed up. So into the modern era, you had the European domination of Asia, and into the 20th century, of course, things were tough, and every country wants to be independent. And now by this time, Russia in the far north was growing in power, and Russia adopted this crazy political philosophy of communism, which is like overwhelming government, destroy the private sector, destroy businessmen. But it sounds good. The philosophy sounds very good, and because it appeals to the poor, and it appeals to intellectuals. The idea of creating a world brotherhood, supposedly, or an ideal society. And so Russia became communist, and China into the 20th century had civil war, and eventually it was the two main armies, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. And Mao was the communist, Mao's army, and the communists won 1949. Now, backing up, we're getting ahead of the game here. In the Second World War, Japan created a vast empire, kind of short-lived, because it didn't last that long. They invaded China and the Philippines and Indonesia and so forth. Pretty big. They had Korea and Taiwan and into Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, so forth. Vast empire, but it was very short-lived because they lost the war. They lost the Second World War. And it's really the end of the imperial era. Of course, in recent decades, the Pokemon empire has been created, originating in Japan. Anyway, so in China, you had the Chinese Civil War, and the communists won. So you had Russia communist, China communist, adopting this radical philosophy of government. And the U.S. was the great opponent of communism, trying to stop the communist conquest of the world. And this led to wars in Korea and Vietnam. Korea in the 1950s and Vietnam in the 60s. Very tragic wars, and up till now, Korea is divided because actually, when the Russians went into Korea at the end of the Second World War, very unfortunately, the United States was allies with the Soviet Union, fighting Nazi Germany, and you wonder about that now because you could argue that the Soviet Union was worse, and we were allied with them, and of course, we didn't know the atomic bomb was coming and that Japan was going to capitulate. And so we wanted Russian help to defeat Japan, which we really ultimately didn't need. But it led to the Russian occupation of North Korea. And up till now, still a divided country. Very tragic. So eventually, India became independent from Great Britain. You know, after the Second World War, the peoples of the world said, well, hey, wait a minute. If the German Empire was wrong, and the Nazi Empire and the Japanese, what about these other empires, the British and the French? And, the European countries have become so weakened by the two world wars that they really couldn't fight very hard against independence movements. So India became independent, although tragically, India's tragedy was the Hindu-Muslim conflict. Actually, before the British conquest, it was a Muslim rule in India. And they weren't able to work things out, and so the country was divided between Muslim Pakistan and Hindu India, and Pakistan and actually on east and west, and eventually East Pakistan broke off and became Bangladesh. And then, as we said, of course, Philippines became independent in 1946, and all of them, the Indonesia of Holland and so forth. So this really gets us to the modern era, and very interesting because China, although still is a dictatorship of the Communist Party, but really isn't a communist country anymore. And actually over the centuries, Russian power had been, Russia was expanding eastward from its base in the west into Central Asia. And then, because of the fall of the Soviet Union, they gave independence to these other various parts, including Central Asian republics of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, and which are actually Muslim areas. And then, of course, the issue with Afghanistan which became a center for Al Qaeda and Bin Laden making war on the West. Of course, and the U.S. is still in Afghanistan up till now, and Iran, actually, modern Iran, which is a center of Islamic jihad against the West, and they trace their roots back to the old Persian Empire, going back to the ancient Greeks, which would have been now Turkey. And what's interesting is Turkey was Greek for a long time, and without being controversial, I think the greatness of the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish expansion was Greek-related. They were, they don't seem to get along, and I don't think they would like that reference. But I think it's true. The ancient Greeks had some, just like the ancient Greeks contributed to the Roman Empire. I think they contributed to the Turks and to the Turkish Empire. So up till now, the issue of Tibet is still a part of China, and the people who want independence for Tibet. The Dalai Lama is the great speaker, and he's a very spiritual man. And the Chinese are very stubborn about that. They get very upset if anyone talks about, in fact, if the Dalai Lama, they get upset if anyone allows the Dalai Lama to speak. They feel offended by this. And I think it's interesting because I'd like to see Tibet become independent. However, you could make the argument that Tibet has played a major role in helping the Chinese evolve by being part of China and being so spiritual. I think it was sad that they lost their independence and really kind of were mistreated by the Chinese, but I think they've had a positive effect on the Chinese people in helping that country to evolve. We all need to evolve. Of course, and the Japanese made a major recovery from the Second World War, devastating defeat. They lost their empire and horrific defeat, but they made a tremendous comeback. And of course, Japan's a very wealthy, prosperous country today. So that's, let's see, we haven't covered the different countries we haven't talked about. Burma is still part of which kind of associated with India. Still had these ongoing political problems, and this woman Aung San Suu Kyi, who is this woman who's really fighting for democracy in Burma. And then, of course, the very tragic era in Cambodia, the killing fields in Cambodia, Southeast Asia, where 40% of the people were killed by the government back in the 1970s. Unbelievable, horrific. Indonesia, this huge archipelago, the largest Muslim country in the world. Very interesting, in Southeast Asia. And Philippines, been independent since 1946, had its challenges. Wonderful people, very positive force in the world. They're all over the world, the Philippine diaspora. And actually the Chinese diaspora as well, outside of China, because Singapore has a huge Chinese population, and Philippines, Indonesia. In fact, I had a student at Restless Educational Center in the Philippines, and I was talking about reincarnation, and he's Chinese Filipino. He says, "Oh, I don't believe in reincarnation." I said, "Oh, well, your ancestors did for more than 2,000 years because the Chinese were Buddhist." And but they, with the passage of time after the death of a saint, religions tend to weaken, and Buddhism apparently. There were Asians who felt that Buddhism had failed them. And, well, for Chinese, since the Philippines is a majority Christian country, it made sense for the Chinese immigrants to become Christian. And Christianity, up till now, doesn't believe in reincarnation. So it's all very interesting. And so anyway, what else can we say? Mongolia, still a small country, and they have the national airport is Genghis Khan International Airport. The Russians were very worried during the communist era, where Mongolia was a satellite, and they tried to suppress memory of Genghis Khan. They didn't want the Mongols getting all up in arms or being inspired to fight against the Russians, right, for true independence. And of course, at the moment, U.S. President Donald Trump is meeting with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to try to work things out, because North Korea has been trying to develop nuclear weapons and making threats, and so forth. There's been this conflict between the U.S. and North Korea that's still ongoing. So, and of course, we didn't talk about the ancient Israel as a part of Asia, although it's been more closely associated with Europe because it's actually not too far away from Greece. And at Turkey, the Turks have revived. The Turks lost their empire and they became very weak, but they've revived. In fact, there's a Turkish school in the Philippines. There are Turkish schools all over the world, and that kind of shows the historical legacy and power of the Turks, of the Turkish Empire, the old Turkish Empire. And of course, Arabia is still the center of the Holy Land for Muslims because of Mecca, where Mecca and Medina, especially Mecca, where Muhammad established his center of power of his religious and political and military empire. And so we'll have to see how things go. And the world is always changing, and you wish everyone well, and hopefully we can get along. The thing is that Asia is a part of the Eurasian landmass, so there's always been influence between Europe and Asia, and travel back and forth. In fact, the Huns, who came from Central Asia, and they became one of the peoples that founded Germany. So it's very interesting. Yeah, and hopefully we can get along with Russia and with Vladimir Putin. They're not communists anymore, but he's been kind of a difficult guy and sort of kind of a dictator, really, and their invasion of Ukraine, former Soviet republic. So there's always lots more to learn. Let's see. Well, Thailand we didn't talk about, with old Siam, which actually kept its independence, even though it was like a buffer state between British India and French Indochina. And I think we talked about Iran. Yeah, going back to ancient Persia, and which is now they don't have they were much bigger than they were before. And of course, the oil wealth in the Middle East. China, the Chinese have been having issues with Chinese Xinjiang, Chinese Turkestan, because of the connection between that area of China and the international Muslim community, which has been there's been troubled and and there's been conflict with non-Muslims as a result. So hopefully we can all get along with each other. The history of Asia. So anyway, that concludes our history of Asia. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.